Hi friends, it's Unicorn and happy Pride Month. We're already halfway into Pride Month right now, but I'm still very excited. If you have watched my vlog, I went to the book tour of Elliot Page last Saturday and it was a blast of an event. And today I have some books recommendations including fiction and non-fiction that I have read and enjoyed. I have 9 books in total and I also have a semi-logical logic with the order that I'm recommending them. But first of all, I want to talk about the book that I finished the last, which is of course PAGEBOY by Elliot Page. This is my most anticipated release of the year and I read it within days of its publication. Like I said, I went to the book tour and to see Elliot talk, and the event, it was such a blast. It's amazing and fascinating and illuminating to me. More about the event in my vlog, which I will link down below. And speaking of this book, this is a deeply personal memoir. It's talking about Elliot's experience growing up, including how discomfort he felt within his body when he was little. He shared candidly about his gender dysphoria over the years and also his self-discovery and acceptance process. I always wanted to say journey, but I feel like that word is overused and if you know what I mean. Elliot is a public figure since he's very small, so of course the pressure he got and also the assault he got after he came out both as gay and also transgender are all under public lenses. And of course in this book he talks about his experiences related to these, especially his transition. But I also liked how he shared some other aspect of his life, including the insecurity that he felt when he was little due to his relationships with his family and his relationship with his partners, and also the lessons that he learned along the way. I feel like reading this book, you can really see Elliot's growth along with his writing, and I really enjoyed that aspect as well. With that being said, this is a deeply personal memoir, so when you read it, please don't expect it's a manifesto of any sort. In fact, you can tell that Elliot is still in the process of figuring himself out. Actually, in the book tour that I went to, he also talked about it because he's still in a fairly early stage of his transition, so he's learning about himself every day as well. As I read this book and also went to the book tour, I'm really happy for Elliot that he's able to be happy with himself here and now. But I also want to point out that my review of this book might be heavily biased since I'm a big fan of his for nearly 2 decades now. But I still think if you didn't know him at all or like you're not familiar with his work, this book is still worth reading. On this topic of self-discovery, insert my little logic here, I want to recommend a novel called Funny Boy by Selvadurai. Although this book is fictional, it is actually a semi-autobiography historical fiction set in the 80s in Sri Lanka. We follow a boy called Aji who grew up in a Tamil family in a Shinhazis-dominated country, and it was also during the climax of the war between those two races. Aji was mocked off by his peers because he preferred to wear dresses and likes to play with girls, hence the title Funny Boy. Through Arjun's perspective, this book goes on with his self-discovery about his sexuality and also the homophobic comes with it in this rigid religious society. And RJ also encountered the anti-Tamil violence and also the racism in the society and learned the brutality of the world. I really enjoyed reading this book through the eyes of a boy. As he grew up in each stages of his life, his understanding about his own identity and also the Sri Lanka political environment is deepened in every stage as well. As a person who's not very familiar with the Sri Lanka's political environment, I feel like this is a very good way to ease myself into this rich historical background. And in preparation of this video, I found out there's a movie adaptation of this book, and also I have the sense that I might have known this piece of information before, but I forgot that I know it. And anyhow, so now I discovered that there's this movie that I can watch, so I'm really excited to dive into the movie as well. Speaking of autobiographical novel, I want to quickly mention Origins Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. The protagonist in this book is also called Jeanette because this is literally a fictional version of her. And Jeanette in this book grew up in a very small town with a very rigid and religious mother, and it's about how she came to terms with her sexuality and also find the passion of her life. I made a review of this book after I read it, and I will link it down below. And because of that, I don't want to say too much about it in this video, except that if you haven't read it, just like please don't sleep on it. I also want to warn you that that review might be very cringy since it was literally years ago and I don't watch my previous videos, so I'm not sure if I'm like, you know, natural and all of that. Anyhow, moving on. Then I have two books that are dealing with the complicated queer family relationships after both protagonists made their self-discovery. And the first one is The Prettiest Star by Carter Sickels. This book is set in the 80s in America during the AIDS epidemic. It's talking about a young man called Brian who went back to his family in Appalachia, which is also the setting of the winner of this year's Women's Prize for Fiction, Demon Copperhead, that now I realize that. Anyhow, so Brian went back to Appalachia after 6 years being in New York and pursuing his love and passion in life. Unfortunately, AIDS claimed his lover, friends, and future, and now he decided to move back home to spend the remaining time with his family. This is an incredible, stunning, and heartbreaking story. It says a few years after AIDS has been publicly discussed in the public in America, and it also sets during a time when a lot of people refuse to open their eyes and refuse to educate themselves on this disease, but choose to lash out on their fear. With Brian's interaction with his family and also the community, we can really tell how fear plays a major role on how people treat others and how unfortunate it is. The family dynamic in this book moved me deeply, and it really explores how love, acceptance, and also the strengths that people can play on each other when facing difficult circumstances. Brian's returns to his family highlights the contrasting attitudes that people have to, and this book did a great job exploring family bonds. So for that reason, although it is very heavy, I still thoroughly enjoyed it and I highly recommend it. The next book on the topic of family is The Death of VIVIK by Akwaeke Emezi. When I was preparing for this video, I came upon to an interview that Trevor Noah did to Akwaeke Emezi, which is really great, and I'll link it down below. And through that video, I actually discovered that they wrote in total of 4 books during the pandemic, which is so impressive. Like, I don't understand how authors do that. I know that Emezi did that, and also Brandon Sanderson did that. I feel like I didn't accomplish anything during the pandemic, but they somehow wrote like crazy in a good way. And now that I have 3 other books of theirs to read, and I think that's a privilege of being a reader because they gotta write and I gotta read. Speaking of this book, it says in Nigerian and started with one day a mother opened her door and found out the body of her child. VIVIK was dropped off at the front door, naked with no trace whatsoever. So of course, as a mother, she was extremely sad and she went to all over the place to find out the clues and the truth behind the death of her child. And in this book, we follow 2 perspectives. The one is a younger generation. We mainly follow VIVIK cousin, and another perspective is the older generation, but we actually gotta read a little bit from everything because it's a third-person narrative. As both of them reminiscing the memories of VIVIK, we gotta piece every clue together and learn not only about the life of VIVIK before the brutal death, but also the culture of Nigeria, which also includes gender expectation and the societal pressures that are put on to individuals. I like the contrast between the 2 perspectives, and essentially it's the contrast between the 2 generations, and through comparison we gain vitality. And I also liked how the mystery of the death of VIVIK played as a clue throughout the story and makes everything I don't want to say enjoyable because it's just so heavy, but I do recommend this book a lot. Following, I have 2 books that both explore gender fluidity and both dissect the male and female binaries. Both books are really short, but both are fascinating. The first one is The ILIAC CREST by Cristina Rivera Garza and translated by Sarah Booker. This book follows an unnamed narrator, and on a stormy and dark night, two mysterious women invaded the narrator's house and started to ask a series of questions ruthlessly about the narrator's gender and identity, and also the two women proceed to have a special bond within themselves in the house of the narrator and started to do a lot of dramatic things in this house that are not theirs. The narrator failed to answer a lot of these questions and eventually started to question the definition of masculinity, and the whole world started to shake and also dissolve. We came to this whimsical situation with the narrator that seemingly we cannot get out. This book is unique in its ideas and its settings, and because it was written in Spanish, I actually heard the original Spanish version plays around with the word a lot because Spanish is a language with gender, so a lot of times in this book the sentences transit from one gender to another and create a more confusing, more whimsical situation and just overall dissect the boundaries among the genders using wordplay. However, a lot of that actually got lost during the translation progress because English doesn't really have gender. So as a Spanish language learner, as well as some other languages, I'm always curious about how the gender in one language influenced the societal perceptions of genders and identities in general. And for that reason, one of my Spanish learning goals is to be able to read this book in Spanish one day when I'm up to it. The other book that plays with gender fluidity is The Memories by Ta-wei, translated into English by Larissa Heinrich. This is considered a classic queer speculative fiction set in the future in the 22nd century where people migrated to the bottom of the sea due to the climate change. Our protagonist Momo is a dermal care technician, so in this book we learned about her story and also her complicated relationship with her mom. This book expanded fluidity from human beings to all over the place, all over the settings, and just everywhere. And this book is extremely imaginative and just debunked the concept of gender. This book was written in the 90s, but it's about the 22nd century, so a lot of the predictions of the future in this book has already been a little bit outdated. However, how technology makes people more and more isolated became truer than ever in this book, in our life. This is actually a very short story, and I read it in a collection of short stories of his, but only this story was translated. But if you do read Chinese, I do recommend the whole short story collection, since all his stories were imaginative and breaking boundaries and exploring queerness in a lot of aspects. Second to the last, I want to briefly talk about a book that I've already ripped too much, I feel like, in my channel since the beginning of this year, but it is The MERCIES by Kiran Millwood Hargrave. And this is a historical fiction set in the 17th century in Norway. In a small fishing village, one day a fishing accident happened and took out of almost all the men in the village. So a lot of women needed to learn and do some of the tasks that are traditionally assigned to men in order for the whole village to survive. And one day a sinister man came to this village along with his wife, and they stirred a lot of events in this small town. The writing of the book was beautiful, and I also liked the historical aspect of this book. If you didn't know, this book was actually based on a real event, which added a shade of heaviness to the story. And besides all the things that I've already talked about this book on my channel, I feel like I also enjoyed the relationship dynamic in this book, including power plays, family struggle, and of course queer romance. The romance in this book was deep and poignant and intertwined with the evolution of the whole village, and it really presented us a compelling situation when love was blooming in a difficult environment. But because I've already talked so much about this book on my channel this year, I don't want to take more time from this video, but just please read it if you haven't. Lastly, I want to recommend a non-fiction that helped me tremendously last year and provided me an entire new angle of looking at the world and also explained so much things in my life, which is What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex by Angela Chen. Although this book is titled Ace, I think it's actually for everyone. For sure, it's not only for the people who's interested in reading about asexuality. Because this book did such a great job to explore and explain sexual attraction and looking at the role of sexuality played in our society, and especially deeply reflected on the fact that how compulsory sexuality actually influenced every aspect of our life, including our social structure and people's relationship with each other, and also a large part of the media that we consume. And by discussing this topic, this book provided us with a lot of case studies that showed us how people who don't have sexual desire navigate the world, especially in such a world where a lot of things are romanticized, and also the importance of sexual desire were emphasized. So for all the reasons above, I feel like this is a very good intro book for the topic of asexuality. However, I want to point out that as a nonfiction and case study, I feel like some of the chapters can be a little bit better organized, but that actually doesn't impact on the message that this book is delivered, and I still think it's a very important book, and I really suggest or encourage you to pick it up if you are not even thinking about the topic of asexuality. Just like reflect on this idea of impulsory sexuality and just how our society works. Actually, a lot of phenomenon can be explained after you read this book. And that's all the books that I want to recommend in this video. Initially, I actually have another pair of physical TBRs that I want to tackle and also talk about in this video, but I feel like talking about the recommendations alone has already make this video like a million years long. So I think I'll just go ahead and read the book that I want to read and talk about them after I read them. And I hope you find this video interesting, and I hope you also find out one book or two that you are interested in reading in. Please let me know any of your thoughts down below, and also what book do you recommend on the topic of queer literature or non-fictions, and please say hi in the comment and thumbs up to this video if you liked it. I hope you're happy reading, happy Pride Month, stay healthy, stay safe. I'll see you in my next bookish video. Bye!